What's going on, Nasteey Nation? It's Nasteey, and in today's video, I'm going to go over everything you could possibly need to know in order to counter and beat an enemy Blitzcrank. This guide is going to go over the best champions, runes, builds, strategies, and many more things that'll help you win the next time you find yourself in a matchup against Blitzcrank. With all of that being said, be sure to leave a like on the video if you do go on to enjoy it or find it helpful. Drop a comment down below letting me know what champion you'd like to see me do a counter guide for next, and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. All of these things are really easy, convenient things that you could do that really help support the channel, so I would really appreciate it, guys. That should just about do it for this little introduction though, so without further ado, let's get into the video. For starters, let's go over the best ways to play against Blitzcrank's abilities. If you're uncertain about what Blitzcrank's abilities do exactly, I'd recommend checking out my in-depth Blitzcrank guide first before watching this video. First up though, let's talk about his passive. Blitzcrank's passive has about a 90-second cooldown, and this is something that you could definitely play around. All you have to do is left click on the champion, and if you look in the top left corner of your screen, you'll be able to see if the passive is ready or not. Your goal here is to try to fight whenever it's down and avoid fighting whenever it's up, or at least be a little bit more reluctant to fight whenever it's up. You can still fight him while it's available, but just make sure that you're keeping it in the back of your mind, because you wouldn't want to commit to a fight that you wouldn't be able to win when the shield is available. When it comes to Blitzcrank's Q, it is really important that you do not underestimate this ability. The hitbox on this ability is a lot bigger than you might think, and it will grab you when you least expect it. If you think that there's even the slightest chance that you'll get hit by it, I would highly recommend that you flash away. This is one of those situations where it's always better to be safe than sorry, and overall it's just really important to try to avoid this ability at all costs. It's also really important to try to stand behind minions whenever possible, especially in the lane phase. Blitzcrank is going to be trying to go to the side of the wave in order to pull you, but if you stay behind your minions, he's going to have to get really close or find some kind of tricky angle in order to hook you. One final piece of advice when it comes to avoiding getting hit by this ability is just always assume that the enemy Blitzcrank has flash available. Never put yourself in a distance where you think that you're safe because their flash is down. Always assume that they can flash hook you and keep a distance with that in mind. Next up, let's talk about Blitzcrank's W. So when it comes to this ability, my advice to you is basically anytime he uses it, keep in mind that he is going to go aggressive. Anytime a Blitzcrank player uses W, it's almost always because they're looking to pull a hook off immediately after. So whenever you see a Blitzcrank player activate W, just try to back off, try to dodge the hook, and then re-engage, because he will be slowed after using the W, making it a lot easier to fight back. As for Blitzcrank's E ability, this isn't something that you can counterplay all too much, especially when you're getting hooked, because it just combos really nicely with a CC chain. So it isn't something that you can dodge in those circumstances, but it is something that you can outplay by keeping your distance. A good Blitzcrank player will almost always try to run up and knock you up with your E before comboing it with your Q, just so that the Q is guaranteed. But what's going to happen is if you keep your distance, if you don't allow them to get on top of you and just press E and auto attack, then they'll be forced to try to hit you with the Q. If they miss, then you capitalize and attack back. Blitzcrank's ultimate ability is another ability that you won't get to outplay all too much, especially if the enemy player is comboing it correctly. But similarly to the E, you can outplay it by keeping your distance. Blitzcrank players will sometimes try to silence you first so that you can't flash away, and then try to hook you while you're silenced. But again, if you just keep your distance, you can avoid the silence, force the hook, and counter the engage if they miss. All in all, your game plan against these abilities is to try to keep your distance, avoid the hook, and then punish the player as soon as they miss hook. Next up, let's go over some ideal rune options when going up against a Blitzcrank. Since Blitzcrank is an early game champion that can kill you very easily in the lane phase, it is really important to try to prioritize runes that'll make you harder to kill early on, rather than prioritizing runes that are going to help you scale. In the resolve tree, I would recommend a couple runes such as Font of Life, Bone Plating, and either Revitalize or Unflinching. Font of Life is the only defensive option in its row. Bone Plating is just by far the best early game defensive option, and Revitalize and Unflinching are both better options than Overgrowth, because Overgrowth won't help you until later on in the game. As for the inspiration tree, some good options here include Perfect Timing, Biscuit Delivery, and Cosmic Insight. Perfect Timing can help stall a little bit longer and keep you alive just long enough to survive a fight against a Blitzcrank. Biscuit Delivery is going to give you a little bit of extra sustain, so if you do get hooked by a Blitzcrank and you're really low afterwards, you can at least have some extra regeneration in order to survive longer in the lane phase. And Cosmic Insight is really helpful because it gives a lot of CDR buffs. It'll help you have your abilities up more often, it'll help you have your flash up more often, and overall it just allows you to have a lot more counterplay options. One thing that is also really important to note when it comes to the inspiration tree is that you never want to take magical footwear, because it will slow down how fast you're able to get boots, and when you're playing up against a Blitzcrank, you typically want to get boots really early on so that you have a little bit more mobility and it's easier to dodge hooks. That's about all the rune options that I can think of. Anything that's going to be in the domination, sorcery, or the precision tree doesn't really have any defensive options, and since you're playing up against a Blitzcrank, we only really want to talk about the early game defensive options in the rune pages. Next up, let's talk about some good builds and some items that you can build able to help you beat a Blitzcrank. When it comes to playing Enchantress supports, some really good items that I would recommend include Redemption and Shirelles. Both of these items are going to give you some health, which makes it so that, again, if you get hooked, you won't die as easily. Redemption is also good whenever somebody that is on your team gets hooked. You could proc Redemption on top of them, and hopefully it'll proc in time in order for them to survive a little bit longer. And Shirelles is good because, again, it gives the health, but on top of that, the movement speed buff that you're going to be giving to you and your team is going to make it a lot easier to move around and help dodge these hooks. When it comes to tank supports, some good items I would recommend include Zeke's Knight's Vow and Locket. These are all just really good defensive items that are going to make you a lot tankier, and it makes it so that if you do get hooked, you're usually tanky enough to survive whatever is coming your way. On top of that, the Locket is just an extra bonus because it is going to help block some damage for your teammates if they're the one that gets hooked instead of you. And finally, for the AP supports, I would recommend building either Zonias or Banshees. Zonias is going to make it so that if you get hooked, you can definitely just go right into Zonias, stall, allow your team to catch up, and you can usually walk out safely. And Banshees is going to make it so that you don't get hooked in the first place, hopefully having that passive up and making it so that you can't get hooked. And of course, just to re-emphasize once again, getting boots early on, doesn't matter what kind of boots, it's always going to be really effective because that early game movement speed is going to make a big difference. Next up, let's talk about some good matchups and some good champions that you should pick into Blitzcrank. So the ideal champions that you're looking for are any champions that are either really slippery, meaning that they have a lot of mobility spells, or a tank champion. Again, going back to what I was saying earlier, if you're tank and you get hooked in, you probably aren't going to be in too much danger and you could usually re-engage after that. So just to name off a few of the mobility slippery tank champions that you could play into Blitzcrank, this includes champions like Leona, Taric, Tahm Kench, Set, Maokai, Shaco, Pyke, Malphite, Amumu, and Nautilus. The slippery champions like Pyke and Shaco are just going to be impossible for Blitzcrank to grab, and the tank champions like Amumu or Nautilus are nearly impossible to punish even when hooked. More times than not, hooking a tankier champion is just going to bring that tank closer to the team and allow them to engage. So again, slippery and tank champions are definitely the way to go into Blitzcrank. Next up, let's go over the early game and how to beat Blitzcrank in the lane phase. The early game is definitely where Blitzcrank is going to thrive the most, and a good Blitz player is going to be in your face all the time, constantly making it so that you don't feel safe in the lane phase. But if you just stay behind minions, if you try to trade whenever his Q is on cooldown, if you let the lane push, then you will be in a good spot and he won't be able to punish you quite as much. Try as hard as you can early game to not push the wave too much, try to let it push into you, try to make it so that you're farming under your tower, or if you can, try to get a freeze just in front of your tower. And the reason for that being is because when you're positioned in this way in the lane phase, even if you do get hooked, you won't have that far to run until you're safely under your tower. Whereas if you're pushed in the lane and you happen to get hooked, you have a long ways to run and they could probably chase you down and get a pretty easy kill that way. At the same time though, you do have to keep in mind that a good Blitzcrank player, when they do push you into lane, is still going to make the most out of the opportunity. They're going to take that advantage to roam around the map and try to get plays off elsewhere. So in those situations, you definitely need to at least ping that the Blitzcrank is missing. And if you know exactly where he is, you could take that opportunity to engage on the enemy ADC. Early game is where he's going to thrive the most, so you really just have to play safe and wait for the right opportunity to strike. Next up, let's talk about the mid to late game against a Blitzcrank. So when it does come down to the mid to late game, your main goal here is to try to group up and team fight with your team. You don't want to try to split push because that is where Blitzcrank is going to excel late game. He is really good when it comes to roaming around the map with a couple of his teammates and picking off one of your allies, and then that will lead to a lot of other problems. Whereas on the other hand, if you are grouped with your team and he happens to hook someone, your entire team will still be there to counter engage, and you could potentially pick a fight before your ally happens to get one shot. Another really important thing to keep in mind when it comes to playing against a Blitzcrank in the late game is that even when it comes to getting vision, you're never safe. You definitely need to make sure that you're with your team, because if you happen to run into a Blitzcrank alone in the jungle, you'll surely die and you might just lose the game for your team. So overall, just try to stick together as a team, whether you are trying to roam around the map for objectives, or if you're trying to get vision, or if you're trying to siege. Just stick together and fight against Blitzcrank as a team instead of giving him opportunities to find picks. If you combine this along with all of the other tips and tricks that I offered in this video, then you'll be on your way to countering and winning games against Blitzcrank in no time. Well, alright then, ladies and gentlemen, that should just about wrap up this in-depth guide to countering and beating Blitzcrank. Again, if you guys did go on to enjoy the video or find it helpful, then be sure to leave a like on the video. Drop a comment down below letting me know what champion you'd like to see me do a counter guide for next, and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. Thank you guys so much for watching to the end of this one. I really do appreciate it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.
Time.